we are truly living in the worst timeline. You guys remember how just about a week ago we were all worried about the death of physical media? Or at least the death of physical Switch games? But everyone was like, no, don't worry. Mario Kart World and DK Bonanza are gonna be on a regular cartridge. Well, this is what happens when you give people an avenue. When you give them an option. When you allow them to further blur the line between a digital game and a physical game. And I know, I'm a boomer because I want physical media to remain prevalent. Well, what happens in a decade from now when you no longer have access to your video game? What happens when you still have the keycard, but the old eShop is shut down? At least when you purchase a digital game, you know you're purchasing a digital game. But there are going to be a lot of parents, a lot of kids that get screwed over because they're buying a game and they don't realize that they have to download the entire thing onto their console. Which not only means it's going to be taking up storage space on their console, the same way a digital game would, but it also means that at any given point in the future, maybe it's next generation, maybe it's the one after it, that cartridge can easily become useless, and whether it does or not, it is entirely up to the mercy of Nintendo. But let's back up a little bit. What triggered this? Well, according to a Blue Sky post, with pre-orders live in Japan, there are many Switch 2 Edition games up for sale, specifically third-party ones. Outside of a few games like Cyberpunk 2077, which isn't exactly a small game, a whole lot of them, rather than putting the game on a regular physical cart, they opted to go for the keycard. And of course they did. Why wouldn't they? They passed the storage cost onto the customer, and they did that because Nintendo gave them the opportunity to do so. So as a bit of a history lesson, companies, specifically third-party companies that are looking to compete a lot more than first-party titles on Nintendo, want to be in the retail space. They want people to see their games on the shelf so they could potentially buy them. Because as you know, somebody might be in the store looking for something in the electronics section, pass by a case, see a $40 price tag on it with a picture of Sonic, and figure, you know what, that's a good gift, and it's affordable. But we all know that physical cartridges cost money, so if you want to sell something physically, it's going to dip into your profits. What some companies have attempted to do is to sell a digital download code, I'm speaking this gen and last gen, was to put a download code inside a game's case. This would give them all of the benefit of being on the shelf for retail without spending as much as actually putting the title onto a cartridge. The thing is, these codes sold really bad. And I'm glad they did. They were banking on parents that would just see a game case, purchase the title, and go and give it to their kid. They wanted to normalize this practice. But the customers voted with their wallets, and they just have not sold well, or at least as well as these companies would have hoped. So, as an alternative, the brilliant and innovative minds at Nintendo have blessed us with the keycards. They are basically what those digital download codes were, but instead they come in a hollow cartridge. So now, the unaware customer, the same one that might have picked up that digital download code and thought to themselves, well, this is dumb. I can just buy the game digitally instead of this if I really wanted to. That average person will probably not know any better. They'll see a cartridge, they'll assume it's a regular physical game, only to find out it is a digital game with an extra step. But that's not even the worst part. What I just described was an example of somebody that doesn't know any better. The worst part is that people that do understand what's going on cannot buy these games physically. This was already starting to happen to an extent in the previous generations, but this is now in full effect. We're talking games like Street Fighter 6, Sonic and Shadow Generations, Bravely Default, Puyo Puyo frickin' Tetris. These are games that you cannot buy the Nintendo Switch 2 Edition version of physically. Remember, Nintendo said that their first-party titles, specifically DK Bonanza and I think a few of the other ones they mentioned, like Mario Kart World, those games are going to fit on a regular cartridge, and they're entirely planning on putting them onto a regular cartridge, which means something like Puyo Puyo Tetris should fit on a regular Nintendo Switch cartridge. Of course, we all assumed this meant that PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5 games would be able to come to the Nintendo Switch in some kind of physical form because the keycards would help allow that. But no, instead, it's just another dig of the shovel to build that 6-foot deep hole and throw all physical media inside there. Now mind you, something like Redo Remastered on Switch 1 is on a regular cartridge without any additional download. And that's because the Switch 1 carts were cheaper. So this tells me that for third-party games that are going to end up being cross-generational, We can likely expect that on the Switch 1 version, they will all be on the cartridge, and on the Switch 2 edition version, they'll just be game keycards. And I understand there is a scenario where there's a benefit to these game keys. They allow some form of physical ownership to a digital title. Like I said, they allow larger AAA titles to make their way over to the Switch if they don't fit on the cartridges. But instead, what ends up happening is these companies decide that it's better for them to save on the cost and force you to spend the money on extra storage. Now, in theory, this could be fine and dandy if games were cheaper, for example, but yeah, that's not how things work. Although there is a theory that it might be how things work. Not necessarily that games will be priced lower because they are on the keycard, but it might actually work out that games that are cheaper end up on the keycard. For example, Cyberpunk 2077 and Rune Factory are on the card. These are being sold as $70 titles. But Sonic and Shadow Generations is a $50 title and it's going to be on the keycard. So there's a theory that anything $70 and more will be on the cartridge. But it's just a theory at the moment. But I don't think this is a cause and effect situation. The way I see it, it's not that games are able to drop below $70 because they're using the keycards. Rather, these are games that are already supposed to be cheaper than $70, and as such, they get to use the keycards. That's my theory anyway. Now, I know what you might be thinking. How is this Nintendo's problem? They're not the ones that told these third-party titles to put their games on the keycards. They offered them cartridges that they could buy, and those third-party companies are the ones that are being stingy. Well, according to reports, there are two carts available, either the 8GB one or the 64GB one. But technically, I don't know if it's officially confirmed that there is an 8GB one. It's just that there's a smaller cart. The assumption is that it's an 8GB card. It's entirely possible that Nintendo only has a 64GB card available, and then the cheaper option is the key card. But even if they actually did have an 8GB card, 8GB is not a lot. Many games will not be able to fit on that 8GB card. And it's not like they have a 16 or 32 option, at least nothing that's reported anyway. So now these third-party companies have two choices. They can go for the 64GB card, which is rumored to cost around $10 a card on its own. Or if they can't fit onto the 8GB, if that 8GB even exists, they can spend a fraction of that $10 and just go for the digital card. It ends up being a win-win situation for Nintendo. Either they get the benefit of the third-party publisher giving them more money, or they get to continue to do away with true physical media. In effect, Nintendo wants everybody to put their games on these keycards. The only advantage the player has is they're able to resell the keycard when they're done with the game completely. But like I said earlier, that only works until Nintendo decides to stop supporting their authentication method, which would effectively turn that game into a dud, and if you wanted to buy it again, you'd probably have to buy it on the new console. These pieces of plastic are going to be so useless that I don't even know if collectors are going to be going after them. Imagine a modern day collector's retro library where they just go and pull out a game and put it in their console and turn it on. No internet, no download, nothing. In the future, that's not going to be possible. Not with practices like this anyway. So while yes, this is better than those old digital codes because it is technically reusable on multiple consoles, the difference is not many of these games were available as digital download codes. That wasn't really that common of a thing. But now, it seems like there are more third-party titles interested in using these game key cards than to actually sell the physical game to the customer. But I guess I'm not surprised. See, my whole issue with the Switch 2 has primarily been these types of practices. They are practices that remind me of why I stopped buying PlayStations, why I stopped going for the big heavy-duty console and stuck with Nintendo. Microsoft was destroyed for this kind of stuff in 2013. But the fact of the matter is the Switch 1 is in so many hands now. How many Sony fanboys also own themselves a Switch? There are a growing number of PlayStation 5 games that aren't even completely on the disc. So of course these dual console people are not going to be fazed by it. They've already accepted it. They made amends with it. They've come to terms with it. And some of them were even born into it. But one of the nice things about Nintendo was that they held off on these kinds of practices. They started to tiptoe in last generation. There were games that were not completely on those cartridges. And many people warned about this and were completely shrugged off and laughed at. And many people are still going to shrug it off and laugh at it. because all they care about is that the Switch 2 is powerful enough to play modern third-party titles, which means you'll get all the baggage of a modern third-party title. This is what happens when Nintendo stops playing their own game. This is what happens when Nintendo starts to follow the crowd. Nintendo wasn't great just because it had bright and vibrant colors. It was great for me because it was the last stand of what the true gaming console used to be. It was the last gaming company that held off on all of these modern day practices that are ultimately taking more ownership out of the player's hand and causing the prices to increase on their terms. But this has been coming. Many people have seen this approaching slowly but surely. For many people, this is not a surprise. They jumped ship a long time ago because Nintendo showed these signs. And again, Nintendo is to blame here. They gave the partners a cheaper alternative, knowing full well that third-party partners are always going to go for the cheaper option. Their own former president, Yamauchi, said that many third-party companies are just looking for a quick cash grab. I'm not saying Yamauchi was right, nor am I saying that Yamauchi was a good person. But what I am saying is that if I know that Yamauchi felt that way, everybody at Nintendo in Japan knows it too. Now, really, the only hope for a solution here is that these things sell terribly. The reason the digital download codes are not as available as they used to be is because nobody wanted to buy them, or very few people at least. So if people become the wiser and realize that they're not actually buying a physical game, then hopefully they'll avoid buying it altogether. But if there's no alternative, and their only choice is to download digital, which they might not want to do because they want the resale value, they might just figure, whatever, at least I got something physical out of my purchase, and buy it anyway. But if they don't, and if enough people don't, they might hopefully go the way of the digital download code inside a cartridge because the customers will vote with their wallets. But that also might mean third-party publishers just decide to go fully digital. They might figure they spent the money on using the game key cards and those didn't sell. They rather just go digital because enough people are just going to do that. It's very hard to predict how this will play out. But I mean, that's part of the reason I'm boycotting the Switch 2 in the first place. I'm hoping Nintendo becomes the wiser. I'm hoping this is just a failed experiment for them. The same way Disney tried to move away from movie theaters for a little bit and flirted with the ideas of streaming their new releases, they eventually pivoted back to the movie theater because even if it cost them more money, it was making them even more profits. So we could end up in the same scenario here. But I don't know, Nintendo is just really pushing the limits here. Like, I was throwing shade at Sony and Microsoft a few minutes ago, but they actually are not this bad. I think there are some Xbox games that the disc serves as the same type of key to get the game running. I'm not exactly sure about Xbox, but I know for PlayStation, many of the discs still have the data in its entirety on it. You're just required to download it onto your console before playing. So while that kind of sucked, at least you could say that the data was on the disc already. In this case, it's just a hunk of plastic. But ultimately, we've been trending towards this anyway. This could very well be the last generation where we see any form of physical media when it comes to gaming. Most people are all digital anyway. Maybe I've just become the old man that yells on his lawn about the good old days where we actually owned the stuff that we purchased. But there is a glimmer of hope here. This could just be what's happening in Japan. It might vary in different regions. I believe the Western version of Daemon X Machina is going to be on a regular cartridge. So if we're lucky, that'll be the case for all these other games too. But I gotta tell ya, I'm not very optimistic about it. Quite frankly, this all really just sucks. Like, this is the launch of a new Nintendo console. My channel is called Nintendine. I should be the most excited person in the room right now. There is a Nintendo Switch in front of me on my desk. And there is another Nintendo Switch behind me on the TV stand. For all intents and purposes, I should be buying the Nintendo Switch 2. But this just doesn't feel like Nintendo anymore. It doesn't feel fun. It feels dirty. It feels greedy. It feels Sony. Sorry, I'm still a fanboy. I don't know, maybe it's just time to fall in line and buy the Sony Switch 2. It's actually not that big of a deal. I got plenty of Switch 1 games to keep me busy. Either way, I'm sure their pre-orders sold like crazy last night. And I'm sure many of you didn't even make it this far into the video and already commented that you pre-order your Nintendo Switch and that my boycott is all dumb and I will eventually open my eyes to the real world once the Switch 2 becomes the best-selling console in the world, because that seems to be a common theme in my comment section. But I know most of you are just as ticked off about all this as I am. So, thanks again for joining me. I will catch you on the next one.